Chantel, and thank you panellists. Welcome. And of course, thank you to all of our audience here tonight and everyone who's also joining us online. So this is exciting. This is the first time we have extended our Fearless Conversations to our next generation. And for us, it's really important. Obviously, we take guidance from all of our experts and advocates, but it's really important to understand what our young people think and feel and what's really important for our future. So thank you for being fearless. It takes a lot to record a video and put yourself out there to the general public like that. So amazing. So we're going to start off talking about, I guess, your individual topics, which are very diverse, I must say. But what, besides what you've said, what was it that motivated you to, I guess, submit an entry in the first place, but to choose your topic? So I'll start with you, Melina.
So, like I said in the video, partly was the thing that really inspired me to send the video in was the fact that I was in biology class and we were learning about mitosis and fertilization. And then the topics sort of went astray a little bit, and then people, and particularly boys in my class, they started asking, why does the fetus grow in the stomach? And we're like, it grows in the uterus, not necessarily the stomach area. And they're like, but why do you guys need menstrual products? Can't you just hold it in? And we're like, And then I thought, some areas have been missed in terms of the health education. It's specifically in the school system. So I thought, and as I'd already completed all the mandatory health lessons in year 10, I thought some concepts have been missed, and this is an issue that needs to be discussed, because if we don't have the proper information, how are we to progress into adulthood?
Absolutely, thank you. So we'll delve into your topic further in a minute, but I'll go to you, Lucy.
Yeah, mainly just the lack of representation in the media, and also there's a lot of false information and stigma surrounding OCD, and also my lived experience personally definitely motivated me to really be the person to come and actually talk about it, because I don't really see much about it on TV that's actually accurate.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, we'll hear a little bit more about that later. And Chloe?
I chose my topic mainly because of the fact that some children don't understand the consequences, and I feel like there should be more information put out there about how we can help reduce, number one, and then number two, create a better environment for it.
Excellent. All right. Well, three very worthy topics, and we'll now go into each one in a little bit more detail, and then we'll have a broad discussion. So, Melina, I'll start with you. So, obviously, you've experienced some misinformation, or maybe some areas where things have been missed or not covered in enough detail. In your opinion, what do you think high school students want to know about sex and relationships? Because obviously, there is some real biological areas that need to be covered as well.
Yeah. So I can't speak for all high school students, but I can base this off my own personal experience. So as someone who's completed all the mandatory health lessons in the Australian high school curriculum, I've noticed that there are certain gaps that need to be covered, and specifically more focus on the biological aspects of certain issues like this, specifically in sexual health as well. So there was also, I also noticed that there was a lack of in order spreading out, balancing out how much of class time is spent learning on this topic and how much is spent learning on this topic. So we are repeated with the same messages, and even though the messages, they're still quite beneficial, there needs to be more diversity in terms of what topics are being covered. So in how to spot a toxic relationship, how to get help if you're in that toxic relationship, the consequences of unprotected sex, how to get help, how to deal with mental health issues that are within a toxic relationship. And also some of the resources that were being used in my class were quite old, and with our society that's ever evolving, we need to keep up and ensure that our resources sort of align with what's occurring in present day society instead of what happened about 20 years ago.
Okay, well, that's a very good start.
Yeah.
I must say, I think when I went to school, it was a very, very basic sex education. So I'm glad that it's improved, but it sounds like there are some really important areas that we're not quite covering. And I think the fact that you're even identifying that some of those toxic relationships need to be covered is really great, because it starts with awareness. So obviously, I think there is also a lot in society today around young people and bodies and body image, which sort of fits into this category as well. What do you think that we need to be doing more in that space? Because social media, we know it can be really, that can be toxic as well. So any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so with like the presence of social media, there's also presence of a lot of myths and misinformation that's happening in like a lot of topics, but especially in this like sexual health as well. So we need to be able to address those myths and say, this is not what happens, this is actually what happens, and this is why. So we need to be able to address them, and what should be done, I guess, is a sort of a collection of resources that's done in collaboration with the government and with kids. So the kids so both parties like understand what should be learnt and why we're learning it and how it can help us progress into adulthood or life beyond tertiary education. So I think that's a really important step that needs to be taken.
Excellent. And can I ask, so with the sexual health classes, are they integrated into curriculum or are they held outside? Because it sounds like you're covering some things in biology, but maybe they're not as connected as they should be.
Yeah, they're definitely not as connected as they should be. So even though for me, I started learning about sexual health in year 5 in classes, and this was usually about something that you would start in for about a semester, and then you'd stop it, and then you'd repeat it the next year.
Right.
But it was more just evaluating, sort of elaborating more on one specific topic, which is learning how to stay safe and staying safe during sex and using contraception, etc. But there wasn't other topics that weren't being covered, especially
it's not advancing, it's sort of staying at the same level.
Yeah, and especially with social media, and there's more presence of sex in the media as well. It's not really being addressed. So stuff that we're learning about through media is not really stuff that should be learning about. Should be learnt more in a classroom in order to sort of block out all the myths and misinformation that's being spread.
Excellent. Possibly an opportunity to use some of those as case studies and actually kind of pick them apart, what's real and what's not from the media would be interesting. We'll come back to you again a little bit later, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from Lucy. And you've been very open about the fact that you have OCD. And, I know that we hear it often from people, I'm so OCD as a bit of a... some kind of way of explaining a certain behaviour that they might be doing in a trivial way. I know I've said it about my cleaning habits, but it's not, I don't actually suffer from it, and I can completely understand how that would be somewhat frustrating as a person who has an actual disorder. So how does that affect you when general society kind of complains about something that they don't really understand and use it as a way of conversation?
I think it really minimises the fact that it is a valid disorder and that it is something that it can be presented as washing your hands a lot or wanting to be clean, but that's, it can present in so many different ways. And so it really makes it a lot harder for people who are struggling with OCD to accept help, because those words and quotes that are thrown around really do sort of hurt your self-esteem, and you feel like, is this really valid, or am I just, more sensitive than everyone else? So
Well, it absolutely is valid. And so I'm really glad that you've shared that with us today, and that we can now all get a bit more of an in-depth understanding of it. Do you think there are ways that we can help reduce that stigma quite easily around what OCD actually is and how it affects someone?
Yep, I think the simple answer is just for there to be more education. It needs to be in the curriculum, and it needs to be taught that it's, issues are valid and that OCD is a real thing, and it's not, just a quirky little characteristic that you might have. It's not funny, or, it's a real thing, and it just needs to be definitely in the curriculum and taught about, because especially if we start from people in high school, then as we get older, that's going to create a more understanding generation.
Because I think, from me personally, and I don't know if you've had a similar experience, but we often hear about more common disorders such as autism, and I think there is a bit more awareness about some of those, and there's a scale at which people can be on. Is that a similar sort of scenario, that it can be, you can have a kind of sort of low level, but then it can go to a more extreme level where it actually has quite a big impact and effect, and that's where people need to understand, I imagine, from a learning perspective? Is that something that you've found yourself, that teachers need to understand more about it as well?
Yeah, certainly. I think there is always a spectrum, but the thing with OCD is that the only way that you can sort of manage it is with professional help. So no matter where you are on that spectrum, you're still, myself, I convinced myself that I would just grow out of it. And even once I was, getting help from a psychologist for anxiety, I just thought, I'll just grow out of it. It's not worth talking about. And then eventually it became a real issue, and it was disabling me. I couldn't have conversations with my family. I couldn't read a book. I couldn't go outside. So it was really actually an issue, and it definitely needs more education to teachers as well, because they need to understand that, we're not all the same. Teenagers are moody and stuff, and we have our ups and downs, but when you have a mental illness, that can be amplified quite a bit.
Absolutely. So from your own experience, what is your perception around mental health support available for young people? Have you found it easy? Have you found it hard? What's happened?
My experience with getting diagnosed was definitely very drawn out. Okay. So we saw multiple GPs until we found one that, sort of felt that my experience was valid and believed me. Okay. And there's definitely a lack of resources available. There needs to be more funding for mental health and mental illness specifically, because it's going to get to a point where you end up in hospital because, where else can you go? So I ended up in the emergency room multiple times because, in the midst of a panic attack, my parents didn't know what to do. I convinced myself that I was going to die, and it's like there's nowhere for you to go except for, the emergency room to get that reassurance that, everything's okay. But hospitals aren't equipped to deal with people with mental illness, and there needs to be somewhere that is.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we also get this message in the media, don't go to hospital unless it's this or this. So then you often feel like, well, I shouldn't be going there because it's not, there's no physical kind of harm. So I completely understand that you would have felt probably really alone in that moment, and that would have been a really scary place to be. So it sounds like we absolutely need some more help up front. And I think we've got a really great opportunity to try and do that for young people, because it's not only about helping you now, but giving you the right education to really make sure that you have a healthy mental experience throughout your entire life, and sometimes getting help early can attribute to that. So that's really good. So look, I think we'll come back a little bit because I think the timeliness of mental health is really important, and that needs to be unpacked a bit more, but we might come to some ideas around that later. So I'll turn now to Chloe. So Chloe, you have a really interesting topic which was inspired by the Raise the Age petition, and a really important one. So, we have hundreds of children who are aged between 10 and 13 who are put behind bars every year, and they're just kids. They don't, they often don't know any better. So I'm going to start with, I guess, a pretty direct question. What do you think the age of legal responsibility should be?
I agree with the official Raise the Age petition that it should be 14.
Yeah.
The children are well into their teenagers then. They've had a year of actual teenagehood that they've experienced things already, and they can understand more. They've developed maturity more. Yeah. And I feel like that's a better age than 10, because a 10-year-old is only in year 3 or 4 at that stage. Yeah, very young. Excellent. And they're still making mistakes. Like, I'm still making mistakes.
No, so am I.
At my age.
Yeah. I think when you put behind bars at such a young age, but not even if you put behind bars, if you are reprimanded for something that you've done at that kind of age, what do you think are the impacts of this on their future? And, do you think they're actually well educated enough, or do they not know?
Most of them do not know. Yeah. So the future impacts can be great, especially since the younger the child is, the more likely the chance that a reoccurrence will happen.
Yeah.
That happens a lot in the courts. So even just court, not necessarily jail, having the experience of going into court and being reprimanded, like you said, is a big impact on the future. And it doesn't actually it goes on their record, but it's not used in a court past age 18, but it is still on their record.
Yeah.
So it does still have future consequences that they may not know at the time.
What do you think some of those consequences might be for them in the future?
Future education, jobs, all those sorts of normal things that will make it very hard if it's already on their record to be able to apply for safety checks, anything like that.
Yeah, working with children, but also probably self-esteem from a real personal level as well. I'm sure it makes some big changes. So obviously the best solution would be prevention to something like this. So what do you think we can do to prevent children from getting in trouble with the law? Is there more things to be done that are quite easy to tick off?
Definitely. I think there should be more involved in schools because children spend most of their lives at school, 5 out of 7 days a week, and we spend a lot of time there. So I think there should be things implemented such as guidance and support groups and just normal activities that support community and encourage responsibility in children, growing the habit of caring for others, that will improve the society.
Can I ask, does any of you have any education currently in school about, I guess, the impacts that criminal activity could have on your life from a very young age? No.
Not at all.
That's crazy. I think that, that's really interesting. And, we've obviously got, a couple from Marrickville and Investigator, but then you think about the rural and remote communities where it's more prevalent. So I can imagine that there's definitely nothing happening out there as well. So obviously a really important issue that you've raised, and it sounds like we can do some really easy things to get that on the agenda. So I'm going to turn to some broader questions now for all three of you. And I might stick with Chloe. So because we're talking a little bit about it now, what do you think we could do, not just in the education system, but perhaps in more mainstream kind of, whether it's media or among the broader community? What could we do there to implement some ways of getting this message out there, do you think?
I think currently in this day and age, social media is obviously a big influencing factor. Yep. So I think pushing things on there that most people are on, creating platforms that support and educate, mostly educating people about consequences and things that can happen in the future if things go awry. Just supporting locations for support.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think the support element, because often kids don't want to do bad things, they're not, but often they're not equipped to deal with things that might be happening at home or in the classroom, and it's actually acting out. So the root of the problem is to make sure that they are happy and supported, more so than looking at, some of the other education about, well, this is, if you do this is going to be really bad. So I think root cause is really important. What about for you, Lucy? I know you've talked a little bit more about educating in schools, but is there any kind of specific ideas around that or how we could get it out among the broader community and media?
I believe there needs to be more advocates, who have lived experience with mental illness. Yeah. I would love to be one of those people myself.
Okay.
And I think a great way to do that is to create like a program with professionals like psychologists and people with lived experience like myself to speak across South Australia, and I believe that will make a domino effect and hopefully potentially change the world.
Absolutely. Well, we've just gone on the record that you're willing to be an advocate, so you might get a knock on the door soon. And Melina, so you've talked a bit more about getting proper education in schools, but do you think there's more that could be done in the broader community, whether it's educating parents to have more conversations with children or other areas?
Yeah, I think parents having more open conversations with children about these sort of topics, specifically with toxic relationships, should be discussed more, and things that are considered to have like a taboo stigma around them, such as period pain and toxic relationships, sexual identity, they should be discussed more. And there shouldn't be that much of a feeling that when you discuss it, it feels sort of taboo when you're trying to talk openly with other people and trying to have a discussion with them, especially as we don't want to, especially with toxic relationships, you don't want to enter one, live it through your own experience, and then spend all the time putting all the work into a relationship and then finding out that it's really toxic and it's really bad for you. So it's better to learn some of these skills beforehand, to learn how to identify these sort of relationships, and then know what you should be looking out for when you eventually do start dating.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so pleased to hear that you're even thinking about this at such a young age. I think it just shows a real generational change. It certainly was not discussed at all when, through school. And to be honest, I don't even think my parents would know what those red flags are to have talked to me. So it sounds like some real kind of factual information from psychologists who can identify red flags early.
Yeah.
And, it's not just for females, it's for males too. It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Toxic relationship can happen on either end. But I think that's a really, really great start, and perhaps a way to actually influence more healthier, loving relationships going forward, no matter where they are, whether it's family or partners or whoever. So that's really wonderful. So I think, look, we've talked a little bit about what we think the benefits of this are, but is there anything in particular you want to raise in terms of how this will not only help your generation, but the next generation?
Yeah, so by just starting off that change, just that sort of spark with this generation, when we have kids, we can teach our values and what we've learnt in our own experience, just like our parents before us and our parents before them. We can do the sort of same thing, but teach them how to identify these sort of things, how to have open and positive conversations with, especially like us with our kids, with our their grandparents, their friends at school. They need to be, so by sort of starting that conversation with our kids and sort of starting at this point, we can create sort of a domino effect that will hopefully last for years into the future.
Absolutely. So it's almost creating a mass societal change by starting young. Yeah, I like that. Lucy, so, I think we really understand the benefits of for you right now in this generation. But what do you see for the next generation? I think, how could you see it helping somebody to not have to end up in the emergency department in the first place? What are the benefits of that?
Well, I think it's just going to make the future generation a lot more equipped to deal with other issues. If you talk about, how to deal with your personal, mental illness, that's going to be able to, help you in the long run in the future with getting a job and being resilient and just knowing when there's a red flag, when something is wrong. So definitely the future generation will be better at, noticing when something's
recognising
wrong.
it and listening to themselves rather than, quietening it and telling yourself that there's not actually anything wrong. Yep, having the confidence to do that. That's great. And Chloe, so we've obviously talked about, benefits of if these children are educated and they don't get into trouble early and they know the consequences. But again, what do you think it means for kind of generations in the future if we get this right now?
Yeah, so I think that if we're educating and supporting the youngest children coming up through the system, if they end up in there, I think that it would be beneficial for them and us, creating a safer world, community, country, making sure it's supportive and caring to everyone.
Great. So I think there's been a consistent theme through everything that we've talked about, is that the education system has a role to play in bringing these issues to light. Do you have any ideas around how we can get students more involved in actually setting the curriculum? Because I think it's really important that the people that are affecting actually have an influence on what's being taught. So I'll start with you again, Melina.
Yeah, so especially I think collaboration between the students and the people who organise the curriculum is crucial, because essentially when we go through school, we are usually told, yep, we're going to be learning about this, this and this. And it's not really told why, how does everything link with another, how do so different subjects link with one another, how does biology link with sexual education. So it's really important that students understand what we're learning and why we're learning it, instead of like focusing on just like the content, think of like more questions, thinking of like why we should be learning this, how is it going to help me in the future, how is it beneficial to myself. So I think, yeah, collaboration with people who organise the curriculum and students is really important, because again, both parties can understand how students are going to be affected by the learning in the future, and how it's going to benefit others as well.
Excellent. And I think by giving some open feedback is a really good place to start. So now, Lucy, so you've already talked a little bit about, I guess, you know, people like yourselves who have lived experience working with psychologists to come up with programs. But what about in the classroom or the school? Do you think that there could be different approaches? I just wonder if perhaps you could have students who don't actually suffer from that, who might be able to inform, well, what do they need to know? What do they need to understand? Any kind of thoughts about how you could bring everybody together and lead that conversation?
Yeah, I think just asking, you know, what are your opinions on this? Asking young people like Flinders has done. I think that definitely can lead to a lot of important changes. And so definitely students should be, you know, encouraged to speak up more about what they believe needs to be taught and what they believe they're dealing with, because our struggles are what's relevant to us, maybe not a teacher that was in high school 10 years ago.
Yes.
So
well, they change, and social media is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
And if you don't fully understand it from a young person's point of view, it's very different. So we do need to ask a lot more questions. So yeah, that's wonderful. And Chloe, so any kind of thoughts on how we could get this education happening in schools now, whether it's, you know, could be between primary, because you're kind of crossing over primary school and high school. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
I think just more information and teaching kids the consequences, because although they may know right from wrong in the moment, they may not realise the follow-up consequences that it could have on their potential futures and how it can impact them.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to turn to our iPad here and see if we've got any questions. Let's have a bit of a look here. Okay, this one's for you, Chloe. So what is the alternative of youth detention? So, you know, do we have better ways of teaching consequence than putting people behind bars? You know, do you have any ideas on that?
Well, currently there's no government alternatives to youth prison, which is a big shock. But I think there should be, similar to a rehab program, that encourages community service, although may not like it necessarily, it would benefit them to be learning how to interact with community members successfully and how to be kinder and not, you know, cause damage, possibly if that's what's happened in the past.
Yeah, so rather than just putting them behind bars, actually maybe having some future-focused conversations around consequence and
prevention,
and why we shouldn't do this again. Yeah, excellent. And I've also got a question here for Lucy. Okay, so the question is, what is an alternative way of saying, you know, you're a bit OCD? So obviously, you know, if people are saying this as in jest, what we want to do is take OCD out of that equation entirely so that it's not being minimised, essentially. You know, what any ideas on what people could be saying instead? Or I don't know, that's a bit of a tricky question, but we'll put you on the spot.
It definitely depends on the circumstance, but I would say just, I don't know, usually that's used in a, you know, I'm so neat, clean sense.
Yes.
So say I'm a clean freak. I like things to be a certain way, but don't implement OCD into that, because that's not, you know, accurate. And even if it is true for some people struggling, OCD presents itself in many different ways, and being clean, although maybe that can be part of having OCD, that if just simply being clean doesn't give you the right to be diagnosed.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it doesn't give you those struggles.
That's right. There's some benefits to being clean, right? But I imagine that there's a lot more challenges in true OCD and learning and coping with that and dealing with that. So I think that might be it for our questions. I'm just going to check that there's none that's come through on here. I think we're all good. Excellent. Well, it is time to wrap up our discussion. I think I've only gone 5 minutes over, so that's not too bad for me. But look, I just wanted to really, genuinely thank you for being part of this. We didn't know how this was going to go when we launched it. We didn't know if young people would be interested in having a fearless conversation. But I'm really pleased that we've been able to do that here this evening. And you are three very wonderful young women with a bright future ahead of you. And thank you for being so courageous. And I hope that this, when we do share it online, can inspire other young people to find ways to have a voice and use it in a positive way and get involved. So I'm going to now hand back to Chantel, but thank you once again. I think we'll give them a round of applause, everyone.